Hi. Today's 3 stories are taken from r/ghost stories. First story is posted by u/infectious drumming. A funeral ghost sighting. I've never written anything for Reddit. I didn't think I had anything interesting to share, but after speaking with my husband about this moment in my life, I decided to write about it and get some thoughts. My grandpa passed away when I was 10 years old. A few days before he passed, he grabbed my hand tightly and told me I would know that he made it to heaven when I saw a rainbow. We all knew he was days away from death, so hearing this from him even as a young child, gave me some slight relief of the inevitable that I knew was coming. Flashback to a couple years before his death, he was talking to my dad and I overheard their conversation. He told my dad that he and my grandma had picked out their burial plots a long time ago, and there were a few relatives of ours near their future final place, but also, his friend Richard was buried nearby as well. The day of the funeral, it was pouring rain and my mom struggling to get my siblings and I into the funeral home without messing up our nice outfits and hairdos. We stood around for hours, hearing stories about my grandpa in his younger years, how he loved to ride motorcycles, how he took my aunt with him to Las Vegas and lost her in a hotel lobby, how he combed my grandma's hair every time she gave birth to their children because it comforted her, along with many trips and events that I never heard of. It was pleasant to hear, while also grieving his death. As we were leaving the funeral home to proceed to the burial site, the sky was clear and there was a ginormous double rainbow outside. This was the most beautiful part of the day to me, as I remember what he told me a few days prior. I felt truly at peace and knew he made it to the glorious gates he talked about since I can remember. My family and I made our way to the cemetery, and as the priest was reading kind words and biblical passages, my 3-year-old sister tugged my arm and asked me, "Who is that over there?" Through a few trees, there was an older man, smiling and waving. I didn't think anything of it, I just remember waving back and focusing on my grandpa's baby blue casket that was permanently shut. After he was buried, my father decided to drive us around and visit a few other relatives and friends buried at the cemetery along with my grandpa. His grandparents, great-aunt Beth, cousin Louie, all of whom I never met. The last site we visited was right in front of the wooded area where we saw the older man waving at us earlier. As we walked closer, I had chills running down my spine, and at first I thought it was my grandpa sending me another sign. However, as we grew closer, we found a plaque with the name Richard on it, which said loving husband, father and friend. My dad told me a few stories of Richard, what he was like and how he was like an uncle to him. I realized then that the older man waving at my sister and I, was Richard. That was my first ever ghost encounter, and it's left a mark on me as I've experienced others. Second story is posted by u/Piglet. My very first playmate was the blacksmith's son who sang for me in the cemetery. Problem was, he died around 1900 as the local priest later confirmed to my parents. This is quite a long story and I'm leaving a lot out as it is, but maybe someone here will find it interesting. So while this happened to me, I was so young that I actually don't remember all of this but have heard it all secondhand so many times that I know the whole story. The last time it happened, with this particular ghost, is actually my earliest memory. So when I was little, the very first house I lived in as a baby was this old 18th century townhouse that my parents rented from the local doctor. Suffice to say, that place was super haunted. It's a story for another day, but 3 years ago they finally sealed the upper floors off entirely and the doctor told my mom that nobody will ever set foot up there again. The bottom floor is now the GP office and waiting room. Now, all of this aside, growing up in that environment left me with a major sensitivity to spirits that is kind of still active sometimes. I'm 25 now, but when I was a kid I terrified my entire extended family with the things I would come out with at random. Anyway, one of the more popular stories my parents tell at BBQs and parties and just to anyone who will listen happened when I was 2 and Mum wanted to pop in to visit her grandfather's grave. Her family are from a village about 20 minutes drive away and there are 2 graveyards, the new one and the old one. My grandfather is buried in the old one in the old family plot. This graveyard has since been locked and you have to get a key from the priest to get in. So, being 2, I wasn't overly interested in sitting down by a graveside to pray with my parents and they were happy enough to let me wander so long as I stayed in their sight, and luckily for them I didn't go far. I bolted down the path and stopped about halfway back among the tombstones where I started to sort of sway on the spot and dance as much as a 2-year-old is capable of. My parents watched me for a few minutes but didn't think much of it and then told me we were leaving. My dad picked me up and we headed for the gate, but just before we left I turned over his shoulder, looked around and smiled and waved at something. They obviously didn't really think it was anything to be concerned about because a week later they went back. My grandfather had died the day before their wedding 4 years earlier and Mum had been very close to him, so they visited fairly often. This time when we went in I didn't even wait for permission and ran back down to the same graveside where I began swaying on the spot again, looking up over the grave in the air as if something was suspended there. It's probably worth describing the grave, but there isn't much to describe. It was a very small patch of earth that didn't even have a border, fairly overgrown and with a totally rusted small iron cross at the head of it. There was no nameplate, no indication of who was buried there, and it clearly wasn't a recent grave. Keep in mind literally nobody is buried in this cemetery anymore except a couple more of my family members who went into the family plot. At this point my parents are creeped out. My dad, who swears blind that he does not believe in ghosts and never will, came down to ask me what I was doing and I explained that I was dancing. He asked me why and I pointed above the iron cross and in the jumbled English of a toddler said the boy is singing, and he wants me to dance. My dad picked me up, ran past my mother and got in the car to wait for Mom. They went to my great-grandmother's house across the street and told her the whole story, but they all agreed it sounded a bit ridiculous the more they thought about it, and since I was only 2 it was probably just a game. So they entered through different gates, they went over the wall. No matter what they did to try to confuse 2-year-old me I always went back to the same grave, and once again, there was nothing special about it. It wasn't beautiful or impressive, there was no reason for a 2-year-old to be so drawn to this little patch of earth, but I always went straight there. I always danced while he sang to me and I always waved to him before I left regardless of which side we left from or which winding pathway they took out of the place. They brought other family members with them as witnesses. They had family friends question me about it. I always told the same story. My earliest memory is of my grandmother sitting me down on the cemetery wall while I was trying to dance as instructed while my parents looked at me, totally scared, and asked me to describe him or tell her what his name was. I don't think I answered her, but I remember finding the looks on their faces just so unbelievably funny because they were so scared of my friend who only wanted to sing to me. What I didn't know was that my great-grandmother had told the priest, brought him in there to show him the grave and asked if there was any way to know who was buried in the little unmarked plot. He went off and checked the burial records and sure enough, 5-year-old Robert, the blacksmith's son, had died of TB almost a century earlier and lay there, marked only by the little iron cross that his father made for him. Funnily enough, my great-grandmother knew the blacksmith. He was their next-door neighbor, but he was an old man when she was a little girl, so she never knew the little boy. My parents stopped bringing me to see my friend after that. We only went into the cemetery for funerals. We also moved out of the doctor's house, but it was a few years before I stopped being a creepy little kid that terrified anyone that spoke to me. I actually did go back a couple of years ago and brought a friend of mine visiting Europe from Boston. She told me when we met that she could speak to ghosts, and after a couple of weeks I started divulging the hundreds of stories I have from childhood, and she asked if she could come to the cemetery with me. Since the gate was locked we had to hop the wall, but once we were inside she pointed clean across the top of the headstones and said, "Hey, is it over there?" pointing at its location. I nodded and she started walking towards it and stopped right at the iron cross. "This one?" I nodded. "I swear this is totally real." She stood there for a second and then started backing away. I didn't have to ask her why. It was the middle of December and yet the air seemed to fizzle and get really hot. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end and the pressure that built up in my head made it feel like my scalp would split open. She told me she wanted to leave, but I was already running out of there at that point and we vaulted the wall like Olympians. I don't know what happened that day since I'm not a child anymore and didn't really see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling afterwards that my little friend there felt like I had brought her with me so I could impress her, and he didn't like it, not at all. Third story is posted by u/ChaseBennett01. Ghost answering our conversation. So a year ago today some pictures popped up on my phone of a guy I shot a music video for. It brought some crazy memories back and I figured I'd post here. It's not insane, but judging by some of the other posts in this subreddit, it's pretty decent. I'm a cinematographer/photographer and pretty well known locally. I had a local artist text me about a video, and after a bunch of scheduling and paperwork we got a date, some plans, and a few places. Everything was normal and we shot at a few different places throughout the day into the afternoon. We had a large group. I took a few photos for them, kept doing the video, and everything was fine. One of the guys had a place he mentioned that everyone in their group knew about, so I just said it was fine and we drove there. It's about 15 minutes or so from the town, off the highway on some back road neighborhood right by the guy's house. It was a house that was still currently being finished, and pretty much had everything done besides a few minor things like the flooring, walls, and cabinets. By this time it was 9:15, have the time of the picture on my phone, and pretty dark out. We went around the back so that the neighbors didn't see a bunch of kids just run into this house that clearly isn't ours. They lit up a couple blunts, we smoke, Took a few more photos, and got back to shooting. We started in the unfinished basement and worked our way upstairs. We went to a back room that smelled extremely weird. All of us smelled it. I'm not sure if this is related or if ghosts have anything to do with smells, but it was definitely off. Not necessarily anything dead or anything rotting, but it wasn't a good smell and not something I can put my finger on. We shot in the back room and everything was fine, although the guy's girlfriend stopped participating in the video. Not sure if that was related either. We moved to the kitchen and discovered the lights actually turn on. We assumed since no one was living in it, although it wasn't necessarily abandoned, it just wouldn't have running water, electricity, etc. This helped a lot, so we used it so that I didn't have to use my lamps anymore. We continued to shoot again in the kitchen and everything was still going okay. Nothing weird besides the smell in the back room. We had one more clip to shoot that day, because everyone was tired and the energy was off. There was room next to the back room with a hole in the floor. The plan was to shoot a video of him singing into the camera from the hole in the floor while he was standing in the basement with lamps on him. This was a room they knew about and I hadn't seen it yet. I went back there to check out the hole and see if the scene was doable. We flicked on the lights and I was looking through the hole to make sure it would work well, and decided it would. The room was hitting me and my girlfriend hard with the smell, so I told everyone to hurry up because it stinks and all of us are tired. They're standing in the kitchen at this point. Now a little interjection to give some background. My girlfriend practices a bit of regular witchcraft. Nothing dark but the general things. Obviously she's not a psychic, but the reason she started practice is because she feels auras. She can't identify them but rather point out when she feels a change, and can usually pinpoint the aura by how it makes her feel. So if she feels an aura and it radiates happiness, it reflects and she can feel it. This one wasn't so happy. Within seconds of me telling them again to hurry up and go downstairs, my girlfriend gives me a whisper and says they really need to hurry up cause this room feels really weird. Now obviously I didn't think anything of it as I barely had time to. I didn't care. In retrospect she never talks about the auras and that should have totally been a sign that she felt bad, but I didn't have time to react anyway. As soon as she said that power goes out in every room. As if it were almost reacting to what she said or responding. The guys were all in the kitchen still. So of course all switches and breakers were untouched. I've probably only ran that fast a few times in my life, I'm talking a 4.740 time at max, and I was a pretty big guy at the time. There's so many things it could have been, but a lot of rational explanations are eliminated when I try to identify what exactly happened. It's not necessarily that the lights went out and we dipped, but more or less that the lights went out, and then we all felt whatever or my girlfriend mentioned. I explained to them what happened between me and my girlfriend, left my phone and lamp in there, and just called it a night. The next afternoon I went back for my lamp and phone, but the back door was locked this time and the neighbor was actually eyeballing out the window. I just took the L. It's all replaceable. Edit, I'm gonna text the guy that lived by the house and ask him some questions about it. I have a few questions about the house, the construction process, and if he ever went back. I'll make an update post. Edit 2, also wasn't aware demons attract a scent of sulfur. It wasn't quite sulfur but I could see a similarity between the smells. Just wasn't as bad as sulfur. More unique and weird than bad.
Thanks for watching. Please do like, share, comment and subscribe for more videos.